There we go.
As the Civil War dawned, few in the South realized that it was the last dawn that much of Southern culture would see. And much that this civilization stood for is reprehensible. Things like slavery, sectionalism. But much of the good, much of the best of Southern society was summed up in the life of one man, Robert Edward Lee. Robert E. Lee lived a life of courage and honor that we have much to learn from. And so we'll be looking at this by framing his life in terms of the Civil War, looking at his life leading up to the Civil War, his life during the Civil War, and his life following the Southern defeat in the Civil War. So first, let's talk about his life before the Civil War. According to Elizabeth Brown Pryor in the Encyclopedia of Virginia in 2014, he was born in the year 1807 to Revolutionary War hero Light Horse Harry Lee, who was actually one of the great heroes of the Revolutionary War and was a great cavalry commander, and that's what he was known for. And so Robert E. Lee came from this sort of military tradition. He was born in Virginia to the planter class, so it was kind of the equivalent of Southern aristocracy. And so within that framework, he decided to attend the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, which is a very prestigious thing at that time, and become an officer in the American Army. He eventually fought in the Mexican-American War, and his commander said that he was the best soldier that he'd ever seen on the field. And his commander happened to be the most important military commander of the entire U.S. Army. So this is pretty high praise from his general in the Mexican-American War. According to Jonathan Horn, writing for Slate in 2015, he actually had command of the U.S. Army detachment at Harper's Ferry. If you guys don't know what Harper's Ferry was, that's where a man named John Brown came down to the South and tried to incite a slave rebellion. And so this was a very political, very dangerous thing in the South. That was something that Southerners were very afraid of. And Robert E. Lee was the person that was put in charge of managing this rebellion, and he ran a textbook operation. There were no casualties. He took John Brown alive, and essentially he managed to calm the entire situation down with his approach to this conflict at Harper's Ferry. And so because of this, Robert E. Lee really had grown in stature. First, he was praised for his conduct in the Mexican-American War. Then he did a really good job at Harper's Ferry. And so he actually had some influence in the South. He was seen as someone who was pretty competent, a very good military commander. And he actually was very much opposed to secession because at this point, sectional tensions between the North and the South within the United States had grown, particularly over the issue of slavery, but also over the role of the federal government and over tariffs. And many in the South were talking about seceding from the United States, from the Union. And Robert E. Lee was very, very much opposed to this. He spent a lot of his life fighting for the United States military. He spent extensive time in prayer and meditation as we come into the next section of his life, which is the launch of the Civil War. He was offered a major role by the Union. He was offered that he could be the commander of the biggest army in the entire United States. But he turned this down after he spent days in prayer and meditation considering, can I really fight my own people? Can I really fight against the southern states? And he decided he could not when Virginia seceded. So he went south and took command of an army for the Confederacy. At first, he was given just a minor role, but eventually he was given the Army of Northern Virginia, which is the most illustrious army in the whole Confederacy, and it was their largest army, their most important army. And he actually prosecuted that war with a lot of tactical and strategic skill. Robert E. Lee was one of the greatest generals the United States has ever seen. He would win battles against armies over twice his size, or take casualties that were very few and really decimate his opponents. And so he was very well respected in the South, loved in the South, and feared in the northern states. And he inspired a sort of esprit de corps in his own people. His soldiers were known for being willing to follow him anywhere. One man said towards the close of the Civil War that to his army, Robert E. Lee was the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee was the South. He sort of encapsulated all the virtues and everything that was noble and good and dutiful about Southern culture to his soldiers. And that was why he was able to inspire them to these great acts of heroism and to be able to win these great military victories. But eventually, according to Pinel Benice in 2015, because of sheer numbers, he was beaten down by the Northern Army. armies. He just was not getting the supplies he needed. He was cut off to the south by other Union armies, and he was kind of surrounded. So he surrendered eventually in Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And so that effectively ended the Civil War. And he did this with a lot of regret, but one thing he did is he encouraged his soldiers to go home. Don't try to continue to fight a guerrilla war. There's been enough bloodshed. We've lost the war. Now it's time to move on, and it's time to come to a point of reconciliation. So this really transitions into looking at Robert E. Lee's life after the Civil War. According to Jonathan Horner, a separate article in 2015, he chose not to remain just a private citizen and kind of return to his home and lead a quiet life. Instead, he chose to become a university president. And he took over the presidency of a struggling small college called Washington University, now known as Washington and Lee University, after Robert E. Lee. And he was a very large advocate of reconciliation between the North and the South. He didn't want the tensions and the bloodshed that had occurred during the Civil War to continue to poison the relationships between the different states. So he actually did not favor things like displaying the Confederate flag in public. He rebuked people for speaking negatively of men like General Ulysses S. Grant, who ultimately defeated him, because he thought that it was very important that the country be able to heal. He was widely reverenced by both the North and the South as just this great example of virtue, and as someone who had a great strategic, a great tactical ability, and who had a willingness to sacrifice for his cause. According to the Virginia Historical Society, Robert E. Lee died of a stroke in the year 1870. So let's look at what we've seen today. Both before, during, and after the war, Robert E. Lee demonstrated exceptional character and exceptional devotion to what he thought his duty was, and a high regard for honor. And I think that's an example that we can all learn from. He carried within the antebellum South was a cancer of slavery. It was a very dark thing. But all of the characteristics that make the antebellum South something that's continually romanticized in our culture to some extent were kind of encapsulated, almost incarnated in the person of Robert E. Lee.